Danny was a necrophiliac. That was no secret to him. Nightly trips to the graveyard were not uncommon, for lack of a better word. He worked there to begin with. What a deal, right? The exact guy who gets his jacks off to dead people got to watch over them every night. Make sure that no one entered the graveyard after hours. No one could see what he was doing. And since he worked so closely with the graveyard, it made his task of cleaning up any messes all the more easy. He had perfected his timing with everything. Though there was only one issue. Danny only went for the new bodies. He wanted the ones that still had flesh on them. Although, yes, they did stink a little more considering they were in the decomposing process. But recently, Danny had not been lucky enough in getting newer bodies. He shook his head, sending shaggy brown hair falling into his face as he looked over the graveyard. All old dirt, all completely settled into the ground. Most of them were headstones with the typical writing on them that said, "Loving husband and father," or "Born too soon and gone too soon," and stuff of that nature. He never read the messages though. It made him feel too much like he was actually getting to know the body. And strangely enough, that made him uncomfortable. He let out a resigned sigh as he rested on one of the benches near the gate. There was a little guest house that they had at the back of the graveyard that he could sit in while he wasn't busy. It even had a television. But it was dark, and the graveyard was located on the outskirts of a pretty small town. No one would disturb him, and really, he loved the night. Especially on a spring night such as this one. It wasn't too warm and it wasn't too cold. If only the people in town would die more often, this night would be even more perfect for Danny to practice his favorite pastime. But it was a small town. He could be patient though. He stared up at the moon curiously. The moon was a strange thing. It was full tonight, which was even more interesting. It seemed like it was full every night, or maybe that was the only time that Danny ever really noticed it. He shrugged and pulled his pack of cigarettes and lighter from his jean pocket. He put the cancer stick to his lips and flicked the lighter until a tiny orange flame erupted. Besides the moon, it was really the only light he had, since he had forgotten his flashlight all the way back at his apartment. This graveyard was too cheap to supply him with something such as light. Once the cigarette was lit, though, he was cast back into the darkness. He took a puff, allowing the smoke to fill his lungs, then he gradually exhaled through both his mouth and his nose. The smoke spiraled into the air, only to disappear into nothingness. This was followed by a long dramatic sigh from Danny as he took another puff, ready to continue the process over and over again until the cigarette was too small to hold. Danny smirked. Danny was a chain-smoking necrophiliac. He was about to stand up and make his rounds, like he did every hour or so, when something across the way caught his eye. Something that wasn't exactly in the ordinary. At first he thought the moonlight playing off of the granite angel statue was playing tricks on him. He hated the thing. In fact, it was the only thing he hated. Its arms were lifted in the exact direction of the moon. It was always like that. But as his eyes slid over it, he realized that it wasn't the statue that captured his attention. It was a figure walking along the path. It appeared to be a more slender frame, like that of a female, and she was heading right for the marble stone mausoleum. Danny cursed. One of two things was going on. Either she was honestly a loved one of someone in that mausoleum and for some reason she had snuck into a different entrance, though he was sure that she could have just waited until daytime. Or she was up to no good and was, for the most part, rather unpredictable. Believing the former would mean that life would most likely be easier for him. He would tell her to go, and she probably would. But he was sure the latter was more likely. Now would have been a good time to actually be carrying his flashlight. He prepared himself for literally anything he could think of as he headed toward the mausoleum, and even smiled at himself as he thought how funny it would be if the person so happened to be a necrophiliac. But at the same time, he knew he wouldn't want that. He would then have to betray everything he believed and kick them out, mostly out of wanting the bodies to himself. When he got to the mausoleum, he was met with an eerie silence, and he could see that the entrance was completely empty even in the dark. Until he saw that the door at the back was slightly ajar. His heart sank as he scurried to find his lighter. The statue was not the only thing that he hated. Going into the tombs late at night had to be on top of the list. Even for him, they were creepy and rather unnerving. He never actually checked on them until the sun has risen and he had more light. But once he actually got to the doorway, he could see that the torches on the walls that led underground were all lit. He was unsure of whether that made him feel better or worse. Sure, it wasn't much light, but it was enough to guide him down the dirt-covered stone steps. He grabbed one from the holder, and immediately felt the warmth of the fire radiating from it. It was almost comforting. He began his descent. When he got down there, he didn't see anything at first, as it took several moments for his eyes to adjust to the surroundings. The room was full of coffins, but they were all pretty old too. He shivered as the stale, chilly air hit him. He was in the process of moving the torch around when he saw something at the back of the room move. He cleared his throat. "Hello? Is someone down here?" he called, trying his hardest not to sound like he was about to piss his pants. There was not an answer, but instead he saw something shift in his peripheral vision. It was in the darkest recess of the tomb, and he thrust the torch in that direction. His jaw hit the floor at what he saw. Seductively sitting on one of the coffins was a woman. But she was no ordinary woman. She was the most sexy woman he had ever seen. And she was completely naked. Her skin was porcelain white, and flawless at that. Dark red hair flowed down her back and seemed to stop right before her waist. Her eyes were big, brown, and the most beautiful things Danny had ever seen. Her lips plump and coated in crimson lipstick. But it was that body that made his pants stiffen so much that he jumped in surprise. Her breasts were perfect handfuls of round flesh, and her body was that of athletic build. Strong but lean and curvy. Her hips wide and her ass appeared as round as her breasts. Danny couldn't speak. He was just a college student with bad lungs and a love for the dead. But part of him had always felt the love for the dead was because no living girls had ever given him the time of day. And now here was this one. She was smiling at him seductively as she motioned for him to come over to her. But she did not speak, as she hopped off the coffin and stood waiting. When he finally got the nerve to move towards her, she embraced him. It was gentle at first, but then she made sure to pull his body firmly against hers, still not uttering a single word. He could feel every curve and crevice of her, and he was sure she could feel him. His pants were getting so tight it began to hurt. So he did the logical thing and slipped them off. She seemed pleased with this, and roughly pressed her lips to his. He pushed her against the wall and excitedly kissed her back, using one hand to cup her butt and the other one of her breasts. But something wasn't right. He noticed as she moaned into his mouth. Her once flawless flesh was beginning to feel rough, and even like she had lizard skin. Her mouth no longer tasted sweet against his, and instead reminded him of what tar tastes like, the one time he had gotten in his mouth when his father worked in construction. The room stank of decay. The woman didn't notice as she continued to try and hoist herself up on Danny's hips. She was trying to mount him. But he knew it wouldn't work, because fear tends to make things less stiff. You would think the smell of decay would be old news to him, but this was the first time he had ever smelled anything as bad as this. This smelled like it had been rotting for the last 100 years. And it was her. He pushed her away in horror, grabbing the torch from the holder he had sat it in, and used it to illuminate her. The last thing Danny saw before he died was something from everyone's worst nightmares. She screeched at the light and tried to whip it out of his hands, but he backed up protectively, still too shocked to realize he should be running by now. She was bald now, and where her eyes were once brown, they were black. She no longer had lips, but instead all that he could see were rows upon rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Her skin did in fact have scales, and it was the color of mud. Ooze seemed to be dripping off of it now. She hissed at him again, and he did the only logical thing he could think to do, and threw the torch at her. He missed. Fear was all he knew as he turned to run, his heart going 1,000,000 miles per minute. But just as he was about to hit the bottom step, she lunged for his ankle and caught it. He hit the ground, and she proceeded to climb on top of his half-naked body. And then she ripped a chunk of his thigh out with her teeth. Crimson covered his legs as she crawled farther up him. For the first time, she made a human sound. It was laughter, as she sunk her teeth into his throat. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed that creepypasta. If you did, please make sure to hit the like button down below, along with the subscribe button and little bell so you can be notified when my videos pop up. Leave a comment, and as always, my Darkness Militia, have a terrifying evening.